the Real Recovery Film Festival, which is the largest recovery film festival in both New York and LA this fall. So we're having a good time with it. So welcome everybody. Pleasure to be here. I usually start these with a topic, 10 minutes of information, stuff I throw out, and then we go wherever you'd like to go. If you have questions on that topic or comments, that's great. If not, this is a wide-ranging webinar on addiction Q&A. So feel free to jump in. The topic I want to talk about tonight was basically staying positive or maintaining a positive attitude, not succumbing to some of the negativity that can be pervasive. I think especially these days, it's really hard to kind of stay above the fray. So I'm going to end up with 10 tips that I like for staying positive. But first, I want to just explain why it's important. Besides just quality of life, people who are overly negative tend to be less happy, right? So there's a bunch of things that go on physiologically with being negative. One is that our emotions tend to narrow. So people drop into a less broad range of emotional expression. And those emotions that they get kind of stuck with tend to be the more negative, uncomfortable ones. So that's really important. Also, concentration-wise, our scope narrows and we start to lose some concentration ability. So it actually affects our cognition and how we process patterns and see the world. It's kind of this underlying negative framework. Quality of life. I mean, people that are negative are just not as happy, just by definition. And even more striking, they don't live as long. So this actually affects longevity as well. So it's really important to kind of take a look at our attitude and how we can stay positive. And, you know, when we're dealing with addiction, whether you're an addict or a partner, there's a lot of things to be upset about. And there's a lot of things to easily be negative about or feel victimized or feel hurt. And those are all important feelings to talk about and process. But I think for me, at least, the goal has to be more of trying to focus on the positive. It's just a more comfortable way to live. What we know about chemsex, which is this fused sex and drug addiction, or pornography, or sex addiction, all three have this hallmark of increasing the level of stimulation people need to feel pleasure. And so it kind of resets the bar so high that anything less than our addictive behaviors really doesn't feel very pleasant at all. And so there's this situation that sets in called anhedonia, which is an inability to experience pleasure. So there's this kind of hopelessness, it's gray, it's depressing, and literally people, part of it is just their brain in early recovery, they have a hard time both concentrating and feeling anything positive. It's this inability to have hope. And so it leads to a lot of relapse based on that feeling of hopelessness and no progress and everything kind of bad and gray. So it's important to take a look at this, I think. 10 tips. First one, avoid telling yourself not to do something. And I think we've talked about this on this webinar before, but the way the brain is wired, it doesn't understand not. It doesn't understand negative. So if I tell you, don't smoke or don't overeat, the brain, just the way it processes information, takes that don't and kind of distracts it. The focus remains smoke or overeat. So whatever we're saying we're trying not to do, the brain focuses on that. So all that does is really increase, besides being frustrating, it increases our attention on the exact behavior we're trying to decrease. So the brain can't handle that. So that's a really important thing. So it's not very useful to say to yourself or someone else, don't do that, because it's just kind of reinforcing what's obviously the better choice is to create a more positive statement, you know, do X, Y, Z, not to avoid something, but engage, connect. So that's one. Number two, start the day with positive affirmations. So, and I know depending on the crowd, this can sound kind of Pollyanna-ish, but I do think that even though for those of us that lived through Saturday Night Live and Stuart Smalley and I'm good enough and I'm smart enough and people like me, all that stuff, who put affirmations, the whole generation was soured on affirmations. They really work. So, but takes practice. So I'd encourage everybody to, focus on positive. I'm pretty groggy in the morning till I have my coffee. So I tend to like have a list of stuff that I can kind of see first thing in the morning and just kind of get my day off to a good start. So it's just a really nice way to start the day. And the other thing I learned early on in my own recovery, if the day is just really tanking and or going south somehow, I can restart my day, right? I can sort of ditch the negative attitude and start over. And that sounds kind of goofy, but that was an amazing tool for me, especially early on. I didn't have to like stick with this. I didn't have to stay mired in the negativity. I could just go ahead and do things. And I have a perfect example, a personal example of that. I am going on a little brief vacation, 5-day vacation tomorrow. Yesterday, 48 hours before I was supposed to leave, I got a automated message from Airbnb saying, your reservation's been canceled, your money will be refunded. So it's like, a lot of freaked outness, a lot of negativity, and it took a lot of work to kind of regain my footing, get on the phone, find out what happened. And, it turned out to be a legal issue with the property we were going to be staying in. But I really consciously used this idea of let's restart my day. I really want to get back on track and not let this kind of derail me for the rest of the day. And it worked. So that idea of starting the day or restarting a day with a positive affirmation really can be helpful. Third one, focus on the good things and not the bad things. And we do have a choice in that. And all of our lives, no matter how bad, tend to have things that are good in them. And something else I've talked about here, but it's timely on this webinar, is what we call positivity bias and negativity bias. And that basically is how human beings are wired. We are wired to see danger and to be alert. And so we tend to pick out the negative things or the scary things in our life. And incredibly, neuroscientists know now that we can really train our brains to just see the negative. So and it goes simply, there are so many billions of bits of data coming at our brains every day that the brain can only see certain things. It picks what it's going to be aware of. And with time, we can train our brains to just only see the bad stuff, and literally not see the positive. And so there's some really interesting work being done in WAIM to kind of help people identify or change their brain wiring, their habits. And that, the one I'm thinking of, there are two little cannons that shoot out faces, and some are frowny faces and angry faces, and some are happy faces, and you have to click on the happy ones. You're basically training your brain to selectively pick happy stuff, and it actually works. So focusing on the good is an important thing. Find humor in bad situations. And that's, I was not feeling in a humorous mood yesterday. So I think that's a challenge sometimes, and maybe it's not always appropriate, but I was able to finally make some jokes, about, I'm going to Quebec, so, about croissants or whatever, and, it lightened it up and it helped. It just got me out of the mood. But I realized there's a time and a place for humor in a bad situation. You can't just jump into that. But I do think it's a sign, for me at least personally, humor is a sign that I'm kind of on the right track to crawl out of the hole that I might have fallen in. Turn failures into lessons, number 4 or 5. So when bad things happen, when I make a mistake, when things don't go as well as I would like them to go, instead of beating myself up or retreating into shame, which was my default state for many years, I try to see, well, what could I have done better? How can I keep this from happening again? What can I learn in this? And if I can focus on not shaming myself or berating myself with negative self-talk, but really try to look at the situation, see what can be done. And that takes some honesty in terms of looking at yourself and understanding your own role or responsibility in whatever situation happened. If we're committed to being a victim or not taking responsibility for anything, that's going to be harder. But if we can own our piece of whatever has just happened to whatever extent it is, that can be really useful. Another one, focus on the present. And I think so often people who are walk through their day with the real negativity bias are either kind of mired in the past. They're rewriting things that happened. There may be some regrets. There may be a bad incident. There may be a mistake they made, or were shamed or betrayed, and they're kind of living back there. Or they're living in the future. They're worrying about what's going to happen. They're projecting a mile out, anticipating all these things with these scenarios that are 99% sure never to happen. So just to really stay right here in the present tense, I think is a really useful thing, and to notice what's going on. But that present is really important. Just a couple more. Surround yourself with positive people. I think when I was in early recovery, I realized pretty quickly the friends that I'd had who were around me in my disease were pretty negative people. I remember thinking this one friend of mine who was just hilarious for his humor and a little bit sarcastic and edgy. And after about 6 months, I realized his humor was really just toxic and negative, and it wasn't funny at all. But it was kind of a good mirror of where I had been early on to not even notice that. And I realized that's a choice that I wouldn't have made. So to find positive people, co-workers, whatever you can do to surround yourself with people that are going to care about you. And then two more, I think it's really important. I can't do this by myself. So it's really important to have someone at least I connect with every day. And that's someone who can be a mirror for me, who can remind me if they see me kind of getting into negativity, they can remind me about some of these tools, or just reflect back, or give me some objectivity in what's happened. And I also think it's important, and this goes to like a sponsor relationship, to really make a commitment to make that contact every day. If it's haphazard, or if I wait to find the right time when I can sit down and have a leisurely call, it just never happens. So if I have a commitment to call somebody, I'll take that pretty seriously and make sure I have contact. And finally, last one, try mindfulness or mindfulness meditation every day. And it's been shown as little as 2 minutes on a daily practice can really make a difference in how our brains are wired. And so, and I know a lot of people struggle with mindfulness meditation. I think we overcomplicate it. It's simply being present and noticing stuff without judging it. So try it. And it's kind of addictive in itself. And people, if you do 2 minutes a day, you'll soon find that you can build up to 4 or 5 minutes a day. And that sounds like a small amount, but that's really a lot. And it does have an impact. So I think that's it. I wanted to mention, I thought I had to print it out, but there was this amazing study of a classroom where students, half the class was asked to write some positive essays, positive thoughts for 3 days. And there was a control group, and they just wrote about anything. And it turned out the group of students that wrote the positive essays had a persistent effect on their mood and positivity up to 3 weeks and 4 weeks out, just from writing 3 times. So these habits do have a lasting impact. And I think it's really important to bring into our recovery and our relationships. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, David. Remind everybody, today's topic is staying positive, obviously. You can ask questions through the Q&A feature. David, you didn't mention gratitude as one of the tools for staying positive. Did we skip over that? I know you love it as much as I do.
I know. I might still be mired in my negativity from the Airbnb experience yesterday. But no, thank you, Scott, because I did actually have that on one of the lists. I retyped it, and I think it dropped off. But gratitude, it's an amazing tool. And I think it's one I resisted for a while. It seemed kind of goofy, and I didn't feel very grateful in early recovery. I couldn't find much to be grateful for. But I think to start noticing stuff and to make a little list, I find it's an antitoxin for me. If I feel really negative, really lost, if I can bring myself to just list 5 things I'm grateful for, and it could be just having a roof, having a dog, having a partner, having being alive, having program, and suddenly the list starts to grow, as you can see. But those, just identifying those instantly can transform our brain and our mood. So it's a huge, important tool. Yeah, thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I
It's a
would add,
good issue.
David mentioned the ability to restart the day, and I do that fairly often. I start my day and I restart my day with the same process. I use the third step prayer, the seventh step prayer, the serenity prayer. I have kind of a jumbled version of all three of those. And then I do a gratitude list, and that's it. I should probably do, a few minutes of mindfulness meditation, but I'm not very good at it. And I struggle with affirmations because I still hear Stuart Smalley saying, "And darn it, people like me." And I just can't make myself do it, but I make my sponsees do it, and they swear by it. So, but, I just do a little, it starts with the serenity prayer, accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, which is my attitude. That's all I can ever change in those situations is my attitude. And the wisdom to know the difference. And then I, turn some things over and I do a gratitude list, and I am incapable of being grateful and unhappy at the same time. I'm just incapable. My reservation got canceled. Well, you know what? I'm still going on vacation. I may sleep.
I'm lucky enough to have a vacation.
And that's cool.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
So please ask us questions on the Q&A about anything. And it looks like we already have one. 12-step programs talk about having a spiritual awakening. How do you describe a spiritual awakening?
So for me, that's really relevant, I think, to the topic we're talking about tonight, because when I was kind of bogged down in a lot of negative energy and negative thinking patterns and negative emotions, I was kind of in my own small, closed world. And a spiritual awakening for me occurred in program simply when that cocoon that I was trapped in, my little small world of addiction, broke open. And I realized there were, first of all, other people that had a similar experience that were having more success than I was. So it was like bigger than me. And then I tried to find something bigger than us. And it was a matter of just expanding for me. And over the years, my own personal spiritual concepts have changed and evolved, I think. But the guiding principle for me has been something greater than myself. And I can't run my life very well on my own. I need some of that support, and I need that spiritual awakening. Now, the awakening for me, I had one of those pink clouds that you hear people talk about, which was very soon, too soon in my recovery. I sort of, it was fabulous. I was wonderful. I was floating, but I hadn't done any of the kind of tough step work. I just kind of leaped over from a low bottom alcoholic and drug addict to being very spiritual and light and fluffy. And what I realized is that kind of came crashing down because it wasn't real. It was just kind of this reaction, I think, to breaking out of the despair that I'd been in. But slowly, I had a spiritual awakening in that my world expanded. It got bigger, and I started to be lifted out of this negative muck into something that was just brighter and lighter and felt good. And when I got into recovery, there hadn't been much that felt good for me. So that kind of was my awakening. Scott, do you want to share about yours?
Sure. I think it's in it's one of the AA publications called the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. I think in step 11, they talk a lot about, what a spiritual awakening can look like, but that may not be the right spot. So if you look there and it's not there, I apologize. But there's kind of two types. There's the burning bush variety, where boom, suddenly we get God and we're good to go. And then there's the educational variety, which is what David was talking about. My experience was a little bit of both. prior to recovery, I was atheist mostly, sometimes agnostic if I was feeling generous. One day, well, I had just spent a night in jail, and a friend of mine came and got me out in the morning. And as we were driving home, I looked up, and it was a beautiful sunny day with palm trees, and you know, it was a perfect Los Angeles morning. I was living in LA at the time, and I realized that I had nothing to do with that. And nothing I had done brought about this glorious morning. And that was kind of the burning bush moment for me, which is like, there's something bigger than me. After that, it was very much of the educational variety. I had to make the program my higher power for a while, and the people in it, I would say my higher power talks to me through people in the room, and I still believe that. And it's just somewhere along the way, and it was suggested to me that I act as if, that I do a prayer every morning, that I create a prayer that works for me, which is the one I described earlier, sort of 3-7-11 mishmash, and that I do a gratitude list every day. And somewhere along the way, I started to feel something in here when I would do that. And I felt connected to something outside of myself. That is not why I came to 12-step recovery. That was the last thing I wanted from 12-step recovery. It's the last thing I would give up now. It is the most important aspect of my recovery. Even though I don't understand it, it is not a traditional religious thing. So spiritual awakening, everybody's is different. There are as many different spiritual awakenings as there are people in recovery. And don't let anybody tell you, you have to do it this way. You have to go to my church. You have to believe this. No, don't let them do that.
That's a really good point, Scott, because there's no right and wrong way in this. It's an extremely personal experience. I think it's important that everybody explores it in recovery, but there's no right and wrong way, for sure. I think that can really turn a lot of people off if you get in a recovery culture where that's kind of pushed. So yeah, great point. Great point.
Ask us questions, but I want to bring up something else. David, I'm sure you're familiar with Brene Brown and her work, and probably a lot of our other people here on the webinar are as well. She did research. She started out at, I think, the University of Houston. And her interest was the difference between unhappy people and happy people. She wanted to know, what's the difference between, and she interviewed, along with her grad students, thousands and thousands of people from all walks of life, men, women, young, old, married, single, black, white, gray, purple, whatever. She interviewed everybody, and she found, the people who identified as happy versus the people who, are you a happy person or an unhappy person? That was like the first question. And the people who identified as happy also identified as grateful. And the people who identified as unhappy did not identify as grateful. And that is literally the only difference that she found between happy people and unhappy people. Was happy people are grateful for what they have. They can be broke with, 3 family members in the hospital. If they're grateful that they have food on the plate and good medical care for the people in the hospital, they're probably pretty happy. If they're miserable and blaming everybody and blah, 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 they're unhappy. And then further research from Brene found that grateful people are happy, and they are much more able to deal with life and life problems. They live longer, and David mentioned this earlier. They live longer. They're more able to focus. They're more able to overcome life problems such as addiction, which is one of the reasons that all the things David just walked us through are so important for both recovering addicts and I think also for partners of addicts. So we have another question here. I'm trying to quit nicotine. One of the hardest. So I've been lowering my nicotine level in my e-cig and just recently lowered all the way to 0 in the past 2 to 3 days. Today I felt completely disconnected and drunk/high, and it really scared me. Is that a normal reaction, form of withdrawal? Feeling lasted for a few hours, and now I'm just really tired.
Yeah, so nicotine's a really powerful drug. It's up there in terms of releasing dopamine, kind of just short of cocaine, not as high as meth, but it works in the same part of the brain as meth and cocaine. It's a really powerful drug, and so congratulations for tapering down and quitting. But I think your reaction is pretty normal. When I quit smoking years ago, I had probably a week of really spaciness and weird things happen, and physical aches and pains that had nothing to do with anything, and I was fuzzy minded, and so I think all that is perfectly normal. I would give it a little more time. I wouldn't get scared by it. I'd give it some time. Your body, nicotine is one of those drugs that is just extremely powerful, and it takes a few days to get out of your system, and even after it's long gone from your system, just like cocaine and meth, it has extremely strong triggers and cravings. And so you're going to experience those. But I would use some of these positive tools we've been talking about tonight. But I would say your experience is perfectly normal with giving up that powerful drug. And those reactions are kind of unpredictable sometimes because people have different responses. Some people sleep. Some people get wired and can't sleep. Some people get dizzy. I've seen everything with cigarettes. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would just stay present, make a gratitude list that you're not smoking today, and keep up the good work. I'm not surprised too that you ended up just being really tired, because your body is just fighting a war here. It wants more, and it's craving, and it's exhausting, and your body's telling you that. So I would give into that. I'd give yourself a rest and be kind to yourself, and drink lots of water, and
And be careful about sort of cross-addictive behaviors, binge watching TV, ice cream, things like that. Because most people will try to replace the lost addiction with something else that will give them a little bit of a dopamine hit.
I might just put in a plug for us, yay us. At Seeking Integrity, we made a decision not to have smoking on the units, simply because we know how smoking, although it's kind of on a scale, it's like certainly less immediately dangerous than meth or heroin or something, but we know it really impacts the brain in an addictive way. It primes the brain for addiction. And so it's a disservice, we felt, to our clients to, like many treatment centers will, have them give up everything but keep smoking. And I think it's just doing a tremendous disservice. So we're a non-smoking program. If someone wants to quit, we'll help them quit. But I think that's really an important piece of recovery, is to kind of move toward giving up nicotine. It's a powerful drug, and one that just starts to control the person with cravings and triggers. And so good for you. Good for you.
All right, David, I have a question here while we wait for some more to come in from the participants. You talked about turning failures into lessons. I think one of the biggest places for particularly recovering addicts to do this, but also for betrayed partners, is if there is a relapse, particularly with sex addiction or any addiction. How do people go about turning that failure into a lesson that helps them do better in the future? Can you walk us through the process a little bit?
Sure. That's a great question, actually. So I think it's important for the person to kind of steady themselves emotionally. I think after any relapse, there's kind of shock, there's remorse, there's shame, a lot of negative feelings that are natural, and they're important, but they're also, in my mind, kind of a dead end. If you stay stuck in the shame and remorse and saying what a terrible person you are, that doesn't really do anybody any good. It just makes you kind of miserable and actually increases the odds of another relapse. So I think first of all, to kind of regulate emotions, but then to really sort of kind of do a postmortem on that relapse and see what exactly happened once you get kind of clear-headed. And that's something I think it's important to do with someone else. someone else who knows you, whether it's a sponsor, a friend. We just kind of walk through. And we know that a relapse is the final stage of a very long process that can go on for sometimes months of little steps, little decisions, little decisions that lead one way and then another and another. And suddenly people find themselves having a slip or a relapse or using drugs. So it's really important, I think, to look backwards when that, and what is so I can prevent it from happening again. And that may be stress or learning how to have some balance in terms of not working so much, or getting better connected in program, or kind of holding out on some part of your life that you don't really want to deal with. So I think there's all kinds of ways to do it. But I think the important thing, once you're stabilized emotionally, is to really go back and see, what is it that I did? And where was that juncture or junctures where I could have done something different? And because I think, especially in early recovery, relapse is almost so natural and unconscious. I mean, people just end up there without really a lot of awareness about how did I get to what happened, where this strong craving come from, or this trigger, or this overwhelming thought to kind of numb. And it's really important then to know us. And if we have a strong negative emotion, how do we handle it? And I would say then, too, part of that process is not just analyzing, but then really substituting different kind of recovery tools in advance. And that's the essence of relapse prevention planning, is to anticipate high-risk scenarios and think through in advance what you're going to do, who you're going to call. That could be a song. Where you're going to go, and so on. So it's a process, and I think relapses, they're tragic, and we don't like to see them happen, but I think they can be really valuable in terms of knowing what's going on. And I have seen, and there's no guarantee of this, but I've seen a lot of the meth clients I work with, where relapse is very common, like with sex addiction. The more program and recovery they get, the shorter their relapses often are. Now, of course, there's no guarantee for that, but I've had many clients who would relapse after 9 or 10 months or a couple of years, and they'd be out for 4 hours or 6 hours instead of 6 days. They kind of right themselves and get back in. And I think that's incredible too, to kind of have the courage to do that. So I think there's tremendous lessons in a relapse, but we can't get to those lessons if we're just mired in the negative emotions of it.
Yeah, I think it's always important to do the postmortem on a relapse, because you can learn a lot from it. With my sponsees, I ask them questions like, did you miss any meetings that you normally go to? Did you skip any therapy sessions? Were you at a meeting where you should have shared because something was bothering you and you didn't? And the answer to those questions is usually yes, yes, and yes. And then we find out what they should have shared about. And I was thinking about relapsing. What was? And then we dig at the feelings under that, and we kind of get an idea of when, the relapse started 2 weeks ago when you skipped your normal Tuesday night meeting because you had a bad day, and instead of doing the self-care thing, which is going to a meeting and talking about it, you stayed home and stewed. And then you still didn't talk about it for 2 whole weeks, and guess what happened? And there's lots of tools. David just gave a list of 10 tips at the beginning of this meeting, and those are all tools of sobriety, affirmations. And, the big one there is, reaching out to other people on a daily basis and I would add, in a meaningful way, where you share what's going on in your life and they do the same. So yeah, and then you can learn from that. I was in program for a couple of years before I got, before I have a sobriety date that I still have. But I kept learning that they got shorter in duration and further apart, and I learned from them. We have an interesting question here. What is your opinion about inpatient sex addiction facilities?
Okay. So I think, of course, they grew out of substance abuse, the same pattern, the same trends of inpatient treatment. I think there is a real need. Now, we have an issue with sex addiction and with amphetamine addiction, in that insurance companies don't recognize it as necessarily requiring hospitalization because there's no withdrawal. And we know that there are some physical, just like we had the example of someone who quit smoking, all those reactions are withdrawal of sorts. There's certainly an emotional withdrawal. So I believe that there's a real important role for sex addiction treatment, simply because it provides a safe place where people can start to explore these things. So inpatient treatment is a container, right? And the obligation of the staff is to create a safe container and guide clients in this healing work. And I think so many of the chemsex clients and the sex addiction clients we see really need a place out of the whirlwind of their family situation, out of the work setting, out of the habit of bookstores or porn or whatever it is, just to get away to a safe place and kind of break the connection and container where they can explore those things. We have an intensive model, which is 2 weeks, and then with an optional another 4 weeks. But almost always our recommendation, people are not done after that period of time. This is a long-term process. I think what we do, better than anybody else I know of, is that we are really comprehensive at assessment and figuring out what's going on. Most of our clients have been through treatment multiple times elsewhere, and just nobody ever made sense of what their case was. And we're very good at identifying some underlying issues and helping find solutions for those. But often, almost always, whether it's trauma or some other kind of addiction, or it can be anything. So then people really, once we do the inpatient treatment, they really need to do what we call step down, in my opinion, which is a lesser intense level of treatment that can be partial hospitalization, which is defined as 8 or 9 groups a week, versus intensive outpatient. So there's different levels, but I think inpatient sex addiction is incredibly important. I do also think that there are a lot of units out there who aren't very effective. And I'll say this, anytime we get kind of a specialty population for treatment, and I saw this 10 years ago with LGBT clients, we would see every treatment center in the country would kind of put on their website and hang out a sign that said kind of LGBT friendly. And maybe they had a group, maybe they had a therapist on staff who was gay. But I mean, oftentimes it was lip service. And I think the same thing happens with sex addiction. People don't really understand it, don't really understand what's necessary for it. And a lot of people get in trouble because they happen to go to the wrong place. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think it's really important. There's a lot of people are, at our Los Angeles facility, we treat both sex addiction and paired substance abuse and sex addiction, just because they're very, very interrelated often. And most of the people have been through treatment for alcoholism or drug addiction, but they never dealt with the sex part of the issue. And so they kept relapsing, or they went to facilities that said they treated these issues and didn't. They were getting treated for alcoholism when they were meth addicts or sex addicts. And it's just,
right.
There were differences, and it's important to go to a place that specializes in your addiction, whether it's a singular addiction or a multiple addiction. I think the other real misconception about addiction rehab, whatever kind of rehab you're going to, is that you go for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or however long, and you walk out the door and you're cured. There's no cure for addiction. The job of a rehab is to dig under the surface, help you understand what your disease is and what you can do to combat it. Our job is to prepare you for the lifetime of work to come. I will always be an addict. I will be an addict when they bury me. I'll be a sober addict when they bury me. Hopefully a long sober addict when they bury me, but I will still be an addict. Every day I get triggered at least once toward one of my addictions, but I can handle it today because I learned in inpatient treatment and then outpatient therapy and then 12-step groups and, through my professional life now, how to deal with these things.
I would also say another benefit of an inpatient setting, or really any treatment setting, is to learn it's kind of a re-socializing process. So we learn how to talk to people. We learn how to be vulnerable. We learn how to listen and communicate our feelings and connect. And I think at least for me, as an addict, when I was active, I was just so lonely and isolated. And even though I may have been I was in New York City, surrounded by millions of people, I was really lonely. And so I think it provides this place where you can start to connect and relearn. And those are incredibly important tools for when someone goes out then into the recovery meetings and starts to take their sober life out in the real world. Those are important skills. And I think the bonds that are created in a treatment setting can be lifetime. I mean, those people they've gone through something very special with each other. And I think it's a really important resource for all of them.
And one of the reasons we do all of this online stuff is so the graduates of our program can come back and stay in touch with David or Rob, as therapists, and also be online, particularly in the discussion groups, with some of the people they were in treatment with. And they can continue to support one another. Like David, I was completely detached from everyone and everything when I got into recovery. I had no friends. I had a family that lived 2,000 miles away and that I rarely talked to. And I had to learn how to tell the truth. I had to learn that it was okay to tell the truth. I had to learn how to be vulnerable. I had to learn how to listen to other people. I had to learn how to care about other people. And that for me started with inpatient. My therapist, actually, I had been in inpatient or individual therapy and group therapy. And my therapist just sat me down one day and said, you have to go to inpatient. You need more than this. Because I needed to tear some walls down, and inpatient was where I had to get away from my life. I went completely across the country from one coast to the other. You don't need to do that, but I really needed to separate from people, places, and things and have some time to dig into the mess that my life had become.
Right.
Helped me. So that's a long-winded answer to a very short question. A while ago, David was talking about co-occurring addictions, and one of the drugs we discussed was nicotine. This individual says that she has been planning on quitting since that discussion. Oh, thank you. She says thank you for discussing nicotine. It helped her.
Okay.
Decide.
Yeah, nicotine is often overlooked as a drug, so it's important to take that into account, as I said, for all the reasons we talked about.
And a lot of people don't view alcohol as a drug. It's socially acceptable.
Right. And I've heard many people say if alcohol were just arrived on the scene today, it would never, ever be legalized. It's just too dangerous a drug. But it's it's out there and doing its thing. So, yeah, it's an important piece.
I live in California, where now we've, along with several other states, have legalized marijuana as well. So, I mean, what impact do you think that's going to have on addiction as a whole and on the recovery community there?
I'm not sure. I think normalizing another drug has benefits and has risks. I think certainly decriminalizing, especially the inconsistent application of laws and jail time for different forms like crack in the Black community, people were just sent to jail and other people got away with it if they were white, smoking powder, snorting powder cocaine. So I think there's some discrepancies there in terms of how it's interpreted. Same thing with stop and frisk with a lot of the pot stuff in New York and people going to jail for minor amounts of pot. I think that's ridiculous. So that's a good thing. I do worry. Adults are adults. They're going to have to choose. addicts are going to gravitate toward it and they're going to have their journey. My big worry about legalizing marijuana is on adolescents. And we know from a lot of research that marijuana is extremely dangerous for the adolescent brain, the developing brain. And we know now that an adolescent doesn't mature, or a person doesn't mature till 25 or 26 years old. So there's a large stretch. And if somebody has the kind of social permission, if it's just so acceptable, I think it's hard to separate that accepting attitude from teenagers. And it can really be harmful. So that's my big concern with just the easy availability, social acceptability of it all. I spent a lot of time in Seattle, and before the legalization up there and afterwards, and I'm not sure it made much of a difference. In downtown Seattle, there would be just clouds of blue marijuana smoke everywhere. This is before they legalized it. After they legalized it, it was the same. So I think people are going to smoke pot, and we'll see. But my big worry is for teenagers.
Yeah, one of the interesting things we're seeing in California is, all these pot stores opened up, and what they're finding, most of them are finding the market wasn't as big as they thought it was going to be. Now, part of it is the people who were selling drugs before are still selling drugs, and they couldn't get a license for a pot shop because they got a conviction. So the general consensus is people are smoking exactly as much pot now as they were before. No more, no less. Portugal actually, about 10 years ago, they legalized most drugs. And one of the things they found was people were actually drinking less alcohol, but they were smoking more pot. And it was a little shift, and it was almost an exactly even shift. And they theorized that, now that pot's legal, the people who prefer pot are doing it instead of drinking. The more interesting results are their prison population was cut in half.
Right.
And all the money they were spending, they're now using for treatment for people who want it. And they also, in addition to treatment, they do subsidized jobs and housing for these individuals to help them get back on their feet. And they work very, very hard to help them build a community of recovering people and other people. It's our belief at Seeking Integrity, and we are not alone in this, the antidote to addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And that's the model that Portugal's using, and it's working, which is really kind of amazing, I think.
And if I recall correctly, too, the number of heroin users dropped a lot, significantly.
Yeah, the number of hard drug users was down, and the number of drug-related incidents of violence and things like that were actually down. Fewer robberies, fewer everything, by making it legal. So I don't know. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means legalize it or not. But
yeah, I think we'll just have to see. Where I live in Florida, we've taken a half step when there's medical cannabis is available, which I think is a good thing, honestly. I was talking to a physician friend of mine who is certified to prescribe medical marijuana, and he was saying it's been about a year, I think, or a little over in Florida since they've done that. He has patients. He has access to a database that shows all their prescription drugs. And so he'll pull up a case, and he can see the number of pain meds, the number of benzodiazepines, the number of sleeping meds. It's all kind of fading away as they use the medical marijuana. And I don't believe they're getting high and stoned particularly. I think it's just a healthier alternative. That's maybe not be a smart thing for an addiction professional to say, but I think in certain cases, I have friends that, for example, have arthritis, and just, they're older men and women, several, and they started medical marijuana, and they're not in pain, and they're not an addict. They're not acting out. They're just feeling better. So I think there's a place for it for sure. I just don't know the long-term ramifications yet.
But personal experience, people can be addicted to marijuana. I am absolutely addicted to marijuana. They legalized it in California, and my first thought was, oh, I can get high. And then I thought, No, I can't. If I get high, I'll get drunk, I'll act out. It's on. For me, it's all one big thing. So, plenty of people have been able to drink alcohol their entire lives and they've never once had a problem. Other people, we get addicted and we have a problem. The same is true with looking at porn and, having an affair and all of it. Some of us get addicted. Other lucky people don't.
And to bring it back to sort of staying positive and the trap of negative attitudes, I think if people are kind of mired, even in recovery, they may not be ingesting drugs or alcohol, but if they get stuck in those negative thoughts, it's really not pleasant for anybody, including them. But also, that I think the risk of relapse really goes up because, we've all seen them. I was at a meeting recently. There was a guy who took his 20-year coin. Just probably the angriest person I've ever seen. So he somehow managed to not drink, but he's not having a happy life. So I think these things are really important in terms of making it, and I'll say this, making a choice to be positive. I think, and I do believe it's a choice. I mean, bad things happen, we have no control. How we react to it, there's sadness in our lives, there's grief, there's anger, but ultimately in the big picture, I think we can sort of choose how we frame it and how we look at it and how we feel about it.
David, we got a comment here, but it's in the questions, and I'm gonna turn it into a question. After my diagnosis with sex addiction, I went into a big depression. I was prescribed an antidepressant, also using a daily gratitude journal and an affirmation sheet. This person says that was really instrumental in helping get to a point where the antidepressant is no longer needed. I assume there's some sexual sobriety mixed into that as well. Is that a pattern that you see, like somebody new to recovery might need an antidepressant, but as they develop some positivity, that need goes away?
Totally. I think when someone gets into recovery, there's, first of all, a lot of negative feelings that have been kind of suppressed that start to move up. Moods go low for that. I mentioned that term anhedonia, that inability to experience pleasure for a while. So people do get depressed, and some people benefit from antidepressants. I don't push them, but I think there's totally a place for them for certain people. And it's been my experience as well that as people start to use other recovery tools, it does impact their mood and their impulsivity and their attention. I've had people get off ADHD meds and antidepressants and sleeping meds and anti-anxiety meds and all of that simply by starting to work the tools of the program. The affirmations, the gratitude journal, these are all they're not hard, but they're incredibly powerful tools that we can all use. I think this is a great kind of testimony to getting there. Now, if you need one, there's no shame in taking an antidepressant if it's benefiting you. And this is not a contest among people to see who can get off all their meds. So some people need them and they benefit from them, and that's great. But oftentimes, probably people have been overprescribed different kinds of meds while they were in their kind of addiction spiral. And in many cases, once they get into recovery, they find that they don't need those anymore because the behaviors have changed and they've learned how to live life in a new way with all these tools. So yeah, great example.
I think a lot of times the symptoms of addiction or the side effects of addiction are diagnosed instead of addiction. People have anxiety, people are depressed, and suddenly you're on Paxil and some other anti-anxiety and then your ADHD, and they're throwing pills at you, and what you really need is to get sober. But I strongly believe there is a need for all of these drugs. I also strongly believe they're painfully overprescribed and often interacting with each other in contradictory ways and making the situation worse rather than better.
And I'll just say, I think it's really important to have a regular, what we call a reconciliation of all your meds. So the standard practice seems to be, especially now we have so many specialists that aren't really talking to each other, they just add a medication and add another medication or increase the dose, but they never take anything away. And as Scott just said, there's a lot of interaction, a lot of potential negative effects. And so once in a while, it's good to have somebody take a whole look at everything you're taking and see if you can get rid of some stuff. And that's often the case.
Yeah, but if you're chronically depressed and need an antidepressant, please take the antidepressant.
Yes, yes, and you are sober if you're taking that antidepressant. Don't let anyone tell you you're not. Here in the South, I've been in meetings where they say that, and it's just horrible.
Yeah, yeah. People go off their antidepressants and then they commit suicide. And
Yeah.
they're sober when they commit suicide, but they wouldn't have done it if they were on their antidepressant, and they still would have been sober.
Right.
So we got way off track, David.
I know we didn't exactly end on a positive note there, Scott, talking about suicide.
Sorry. But you use David's tips for positivity. Anything you want to tell us in closing, David?
No, just I think to go back, it's a choice. It's a choice. We can choose to be positive, and it starts to be self-sustaining. It carries ourselves forward. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, thank you, David. Everybody, we'll be back next week. Thank everybody for attending, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.